On the 24th of July 1915, the tramp steamer Prince Charles wallowed through grey Atlantic swells 140 miles southwest of Ireland. Her rusty plates streaked with salt, her single smokestack belching the dirty coal smoke of an ageing merchant vessel. Through his periscope, Captain Lieutenant Otto Steinbrink of U-36 studied her. 373 tons, perhaps 8 knots maximum speed, riding high and empty, utterly defenseless. Standard protocol demanded he surface and sink her with gunfire rather than waste a precious torpedo on such insignificant prey. What Steinbrink couldn't see beneath those weathered deck planks were 4 12-pounder guns, their crews crouched in silence, and a naval officer named Gordon Campbell who'd spent months training his men for precisely this moment. When U-36 broke the surface 800 yards off the port beam, Prince Charles dropped her false panels and Campbell's guns opened fire. The first salvo struck home. The submarine's conning tower was hit twice before she could dive. She surfaced again, mortally wounded 35 minutes later. Campbell's gunners found their mark again. U-36 went down with all hands. This wasn't a fluke. This was the opening salvo of the most audacious confidence trick in naval warfare, Britain's Q-ship campaign, where the Royal Navy disguised warships as decrepit merchantmen and turned the hunter-prey relationship of submarine warfare completely on its head. On paper, the idea was absurd, sending armed vessels disguised as helpless targets into waters where German U-boats prowled with impunity, relying on the enemy to approach close enough to be killed. Standard naval doctrine emphasized armored warships hunting submarines with depth charges and hydrophones. Yet between 1915 and 1918, Britain deployed 366 Q-ships that would account for 11 confirmed U-boat kills and damage to dozens more. The apparent vulnerability of these vessels, their rust, their age, their pathetic speed, wasn't a liability. It was the entire operational concept. By late 1914, the German U-boat threat had exceeded every Royal Navy projection. Naval theorists had predicted submarines would serve primarily as coastal defense vessels, too fragile and short-ranged for sustained Atlantic operations. They were wrong. Germany's Type U-31 submarines, entering service in 1915, could remain at sea for 6 weeks. Crews at 16 knots surfaced and carried 16 torpedoes plus an 88mm deck gun. Each torpedo cost the equivalent of £1,000 and required precision firing solutions, valuable weapons ill-spent on tramp steamers and coastal colliers. The tactical mathematics favoured surface gun attacks on undefended merchants. A U-boat could sink a dozen cargo vessels with gunfire, whilst preserving its entire torpedo complement for armed adversaries. Standard practice was to surface 800 to 1,200 yards from the target, order the crew to abandon ship, then methodically destroy the vessel with the deck gun. This created a lethal vulnerability. For those crucial minutes whilst the U-boat sat on the surface shelling its victim, it was as exposed as any surface vessel, and far more fragile. The pressure hull of a Type U-31 could withstand depths of 50 meters, but was armored against water pressure, not shell fire. A single 12-pounder shell penetrating the pressure hull could kill a submarine just as effectively as a torpedo. Yet conventional anti-submarine doctrine focused on destroyers and depth charges, trying to hunt submarines underwater where they were nearly invisible. What if, instead, you made the submarine want to surface? What if you turned the U-boat's own tactical preference, surface gun attacks on easy prey, into a fatal trap? The Admiralty's answer was HMS Farnborough, commissioned in March 1915 as the first purpose-built Q-ship. She began life as the collier Lodderer, 2,400 tons, built in 1895, precisely the sort of vessel U-boats attacked dozens of times weekly. Naval architects stripped her holds and installed 4 12-pounder guns behind hinged deck panels, a 6-pounder concealed in the stern, and a 3-pounder disguised as deck cargo. Her crew of 65 included Royal Navy gunners, but they wore merchant seamen's clothing and lived in deliberately squalid conditions. The ship was registered under the merchant flag. Her radio was silenced except for distress calls. She trailed oil to simulate engine trouble. Everything about Farnborough screamed harmless victim. Critics in the Admiralty argued this was sending good men to die in floating coffins, relying on enemy commanders to make tactical errors. They were right about the risk, but profoundly wrong about the error. What made Q-ships work wasn't any single engineering feature, but rather an elaborate performance sustained under conditions that would break most men. When a U-boat surfaced, the Q-ship's crew executed what the Royal Navy called the panic party drill. A portion of the crew, usually 5 to 8 men, would rush about the deck in theatrical terror, lower a boat with deliberate clumsiness, and row frantically away from the merchantman. They carried false ship's papers identifying the vessel as, say, the Vittoria of Bergen or Clementina of Genoa. Their clothing was authentic merchant gear, purchased from actual sailors or requisitioned from captured vessels. Many Q-ship officers learned basic Norwegian, Danish or neutral nation seafaring terms to maintain the deception if questioned. One panic party member on HMS Dunraven later recalled, "You had to be genuinely convincing. If you rowed too well, if the boat launched too smoothly, if you didn't look properly terrified, the U-boat would dive and you'd wasted months of preparation." The remaining crew, the fighting crew, remained hidden below decks or behind false bulkheads, lying absolutely motionless whilst the U-boat's commander studied the apparently abandoned ship through binoculars. This could last 5 minutes or 30. Men crouched beside their guns in silence, whilst the submarine's deck gun fired ranging shots into their vessel, shells punching through wooden superstructure meters from where they hid. HMS Penshurst took 7 direct hits during one engagement in September 1916, before her commander, Lieutenant R.C. Stewart, judged the U-boat close enough to guarantee a kill. The discipline required was extraordinary. Dozens of men enduring shell fire, unable to see their attacker, waiting for an order that might never come. The technical challenge of concealing naval guns on a merchant vessel was considerable. The standard 12-pounder quick-firing gun weighed 1,200 weight, 610 kilograms, including its mounting, and required a crew of 5 to operate at maximum rate of fire, 15 rounds per minute. Each gun needed a clear field of fire across 270 degrees, yet had to be completely invisible until the moment of engagement. Naval constructors developed hinged panels disguised as deck houses, cargo hatches, even chicken coops. The panels were counterweighted to fall away in seconds when released. Gun crews rehearsed the sequence endlessly. Release catch, panels fall, gun swings into firing position, first round away, all within 7 seconds of the command to engage. On HMS Tamarisk, Commander Francis Henry Grenfell had his crews practice the drill with stopwatches, demanding consistent performance under 6 seconds. The U-boat commander has perhaps 2 seconds to recognise his error and dive, Grenfell noted. We must hit him before he's under. But Q-ships carried a deeper deception than hidden guns. Their apparent obsolescence, the rust, the smoke, the laborious rolling in modest seas was meticulously maintained theatre. Q-ships used deliberately inefficient coal to produce more visible smoke. They varied their speed erratically to suggest engine problems. They listed slightly to one side to appear poorly laden or damaged. HMS Result, operating in 1917, had her crew actually rust the deck fittings with acid wash and scatter authentic cargo debris, broken crates, loose rope, rusted chain about her decks. "We looked," wrote one officer, "like a ship whose owners couldn't afford paint, much less naval guns." This wasn't accidental. U-boat commanders targeted the weakest, slowest, most isolated vessels because they required less time on the dangerous surface. The worse a Q-ship looked, the more attractive a target she became. The tactical geometry of Q-ship engagement was brutally precise. A surfaced U-boat typically attacked from 800 to 1,200 yards, close enough for accurate deck gun fire, far enough to dive if threatened. British 12-pounder guns had an effective range of 5,000 yards, but achieved optimal accuracy at under 1,000 yards. The Q-ship commander's decision when to drop the disguise and open fire determined whether the engagement resulted in a kill, a damaged submarine, or the submarine escaping. Open fire too early and the U-boat dives safely. Wait too long and the U-boat might notice something amiss, perhaps the way the ship rides in the water or unusual response to damage, and submerge. Gordon Campbell, who commanded multiple Q-ships including Farnborough and later Barges, developed what became the standard engagement doctrine. He would allow the U-boat to close to 600 yards or less, point-blank range where even the first ranging shots would achieve lethal accuracy. The U-boat must commit completely, Campbell wrote. He must be so focused on destroying your ship, so confident in your helplessness, that his lookouts relax. That's when you have him. On 7th of June 1917, commanding Barges, disguised as the merchantman Victoria, Campbell allowed U-29 to close to 400 yards and pump shells into his vessel for 25 minutes. Barges took 24 hits. Her mainmast was shot away. Fires broke out amidships. Campbell held fire lying in the wreckage with his gun crews waiting. When U-29 closed to 350 yards to administer the coup de grace, Campbell's guns fired. The first 3 rounds struck U-29's conning tower and pressure hull. She sank in 90 seconds. The engagement data from Q-ship actions reveals the brutal calculus. Of 150 recorded engagements where Q-ships opened fire on surfaced U-boats, 43 resulted in the submarine diving successfully before suffering critical damage. 82 resulted in damage but not destruction. The submarine escaped underwater, often leaking oil and trailing air bubbles. 25 resulted in confirmed kills. The difference between these outcomes came down to range and surprise. Engagements where Q-ships opened fire at ranges beyond 700 yards resulted in kills only 9% of the time. Engagements at 500 yards or less achieved kills in 62% of cases. The strategy demanded nerves of absolute steel, enduring sustained attack whilst waiting for geometry and psychology to align perfectly. Critics argued this approach sacrificed too many good ships and men for marginal results. After all, 11 confirmed U-boat kills from 366 Q-ships deployed seems poor return. They missed the strategic dimension entirely. U-boat warfare relied on surface attacks on merchants because torpedoes were precious and gun ammunition was cheap. By mid-1916, the Q-ship campaign had introduced crippling uncertainty into this equation. Any apparently defenseless merchantman might be a Q-ship. German submarine doctrine was forced to evolve. U-boats began attacking from greater ranges, using more torpedoes on merchant targets, being far more cautious about surface engagements. This slowed their rate of sinkings and increased their operational costs dramatically. A U-boat that expended all 16 torpedoes on merchantmen had to return to port for resupply, cutting patrol duration from 40 days to perhaps 25. The Q-ship's real victory wasn't in submarines sunk, it was in submarines made cautious, forced underwater, rendered less effective across the entire Atlantic. The Q-ship service extracted a horrific toll on its volunteers. Between 1915 and 1918, 61 Q-ships were sunk, with 289 crew killed and hundreds more wounded. The men who served aboard these vessels lived for months in deliberately squalid conditions, maintaining the fiction of merchant service whilst waiting for combat that might never come. Lieutenant William Sanders, commanding HMS Helgoland, disguised as Lovingly, spent 4 months at sea in 1916 without encountering a single U-boat. When U-93 finally attacked on the 30th of April 1917, Sanders' crew had practiced their drill so many times they executed it perfectly despite the U-boat opening fire at long range. They damaged U-93 sufficiently that she limped back to Germany and was under repair for 4 months. Sanders was awarded the Victoria Cross, He died 5 months later when another U-boat torpedoed his new command, HMS Prize, before he could spring the trap. The psychological strain was immense. Q-ship crews endured shellfire whilst unable to fight back, maintaining absolute discipline whilst their vessel disintegrated around them. On HMS Dunraven, engaging UC-71 on the 8th of August 1917, the Q-ship took over 30 direct hits during a 40-minute engagement. The captain, Gordon Campbell, by now a commander, later wrote, "The aftergun crew were entirely exposed, the plates around them torn like paper. I could see the gun layer tracking the U-boat while shells burst within feet of his position. Not a man moved to take cover. Dunraven was abandoned and sunk, but not before her guns damaged UC-71 so severely she had to surface and was captured." Campbell received a second Victoria Cross. He remains one of only 3 men awarded the decoration twice during the First World War. The Panic Party faced particular danger. These men rowed away from their ship in open boats, whilst the U-boat shelled the Q-ship, hoping the submarine wouldn't fire on the survivors, but knowing there was no guarantee. If the Q-ship sank or was abandoned, the Panic Party was genuinely adrift in lifeboats, miles from shore, in Atlantic waters. If the engagement went badly, if the Q-ship's guns failed to sink the U-boat, the Panic Party and their lifeboat became witnesses to their comrades' destruction, too far away to help. On multiple occasions, panic parties were forced to watch their mother ship torpedoed and sunk after the deception failed, then spent days in open boats before rescue. Yet Q-ship service was entirely voluntary, and there was never shortage of volunteers. The ships were predominantly crewed by Royal Navy Reserve personnel, merchant seamen who joined the Naval Reserve and received gunnery training. These men understood merchant ships intimately and could maintain the deception convincingly. Many were survivors of merchant vessels torpedoed by U-boats and volunteered for Q-ship service explicitly seeking vengeance. Discipline problems were virtually unknown. The ship's logs record endless hours of gunnery practice, disguise drills, and damage control training. Crews competed to reduce their time from concealed to first shot fired, the way destroyer crews competed in torpedo exercises. German submarine commanders weren't fools, and they learned. By late 1916, U-boat doctrine had evolved to treat all merchant vessels with suspicion. Commanders kept greater distance, studied ships longer before attacking, looked for telltale signs, the way a ship responded to the helm, whether her crew's panic seemed genuine, whether she sent proper distress signals. Some U-boats began firing a few ranging shots and then diving, resurfacing a quarter-hour later from a different direction to see if the apparently abandoned hulk had moved or shown any sign of crew remaining aboard. The Q-ship campaign became a duel of intelligence and adaptation. The Admiralty responded by increasing the sophistication of the disguises. Later, Q-ships carried elaborate false cargoes, actual timber on deck, livestock, even automobiles lashed to the deck as visible cargo. HMS Hyderabad, operating in 1917, was disguised as an American merchantman complete with American flags, crew members who could speak with American accents, and meticulously forged papers placing her registry in Baltimore. When stopped by U-105 in September 1917, the panic party's captain, actually Lieutenant C.M. Hamblin, RNR, presented papers and argued in a perfect Boston accent about American neutrality whilst U-105's commander studied the ship. The U-boat dove without firing. Hyderabad never got her kill, but she'd survived an inspection that would have exposed most Q-ships. Some Q-ships began towing submarines. HMS Taranaki deployed in 1917 with a British E-class submarine towed 400 yards astern, submerged to periscope depth, connected by telephone cable. The idea was that when a U-boat attacked Taranaki, the British submarine would slip its tow and torpedo the German from behind whilst the Q-ship engaged from ahead. It worked precisely once. On the 23rd of June 1917, HM submarine C-27 torpedoed UC-44, whilst the German was focused on shelling Taranaki. The tactic was abandoned shortly after. It was technically complex. dangerous to the towed submarine and tied up 2 vessels to achieve what one Q-ship might accomplish alone. The Q-ship concept evolved in another direction. Decoy ships deliberately made to look like Q-ships. By 1917, German intelligence had photographs and descriptions of several Q-ships that had survived engagements. The Admiralty began deploying genuinely unarmed merchantmen modified to look like Q-ships, visible gun positions, suspicious-looking deck structures, sailing in U-boat infested waters as bait. The hope was that U-boats, recognizing an apparent Q-ship, would use precious torpedoes rather than surface gun attacks, or avoid the vessel entirely. Either outcome served British interests. Torpedoes expended on decoys couldn't sink genuine merchants, and U-boats avoiding suspicious vessels reduced overall attack rates. The deception had become recursive, fakes disguised as warships disguised as merchants, all designed to paralyze German decision-making. The Q-ship campaign succeeded not because of superior technology or firepower, but because it weaponized the enemy's rational tactical choices. German U-boat doctrine prioritized surface gun attacks on merchants for entirely sound reasons. Torpedoes were expensive and limited, gun ammunition was cheap and plentiful, and undefended merchants couldn't fight back. This doctrine was based on accurate assessment of material reality. Every tactical manual, every after-action analysis, every calculation of cost-effectiveness supported this approach. The Q-ship didn't prove this doctrine wrong, it made it dangerous. This distinction is crucial. The Royal Navy didn't build Q-ships hoping U-boat commanders would make mistakes. They built Q-ships because U-boat commanders would make correct decisions that happened to serve British strategic interests. A U-boat surfacing to shell an apparently helpless merchant was following best practice. The intelligence failure wasn't tactical but existential. German submarine doctrine couldn't account for the possibility that the Royal Navy would deliberately disguise warships as victims and send them into danger. It violated naval convention, military logic and common sense. Yet it worked precisely because it was unexpected. The psychological impact on U-boat crews was considerable. Captured German submarine officers, interrogated after being taken prisoner, repeatedly mentioned fear of Q-ships. Captain Lieutenant Klaus Rücker, captured when U-34 was destroyed by Q-ship HMS Stonecrop in November 1918, described the constant tension. Every merchant vessel became potentially deadly. We spent more time studying targets, watching for signs of disguise. This increased our time on the surface, our exposure to aircraft and destroyers. The Q-ships made us cautious, and caution reduced our effectiveness. This was the strategic victory, not kills achieved but doubt introduced. The deeper principle was this: battlefields aren't clean testing environments, and superiority on paper often proves meaningless against an opponent who refuses to fight the expected way. German U-boats were technologically superior to modified merchant vessels in every measurable way: speed, armament, survivability, tactical flexibility. But these advantages depended on the enemy behaving predictably. Q-ships exploited not German weakness, but German strength turned into overconfidence. The U-boat commander who approached close to an apparently defenseless target wasn't being foolish. He was being efficient. The Q-ship converted efficiency into vulnerability. By 1918, the Q-ship campaign was effectively over. Germany's adoption of unrestricted submarine warfare in February 1917, attacking all vessels including neutrals without warning, reduced U-boat surface attacks dramatically. Submarines increasingly used torpedoes from submerged positions, denying Q-ships the surface target they required. The introduction of convoy systems with merchant vessels sailing under destroyer escort reduced independent merchant traffic. Q-ships found fewer opportunities to deploy. The last Q-ship kill occurred on the 11th of November 1918. HMS Cymric damaged UB-90 so severely she was scuttled by her crew. It was Armistice Day. The war ended hours later. The final accounting was stark. 366 Q-ships deployed, 11 confirmed U-boat kills, dozens more damaged. 27 Victoria Crosses awarded to Q-ship personnel, the highest ratio of Britain's highest military decoration to force size in any service. 61 Q-ships sunk, 289 dead. Critics after the war pointed to these figures as evidence the Q-ship campaign achieved too little at too high a cost. They continued to miss the point. The Q-ship's value was never measured in kills per ship, but in psychological impact per patrol. Every Q-ship at sea forced U-boats to waste time, expend torpedoes, maintain greater caution. The campaign's true measure was in merchant tonnage not sunk because U-boats remained submerged, in U-boat patrol efficiency degraded by introduced uncertainty. Modern naval historians recognize Q-ships as one of the first successful implementations of asymmetric naval warfare, using deliberately inferior platforms to exploit enemy tactical doctrine. The concept reappeared in various forms: Soviet merchant vessels carrying concealed missiles during the Cold War, modern naval vessels disguised as commercial shipping. The principle remains: when your enemy has superior force, make them uncertain which targets are genuine threats. Force them to expend premium weapons on questionable targets. Slow their operations by introducing doubt. Gordon Campbell, the Q-ship commander who typified the service's spirit, wrote after the war, "We were not heroes, we were bait, but we were bait with teeth, and we proved that apparent weakness, properly employed, could become devastating strength." The U-boat commanders weren't fools. They were professionals following sound doctrine. We simply made sound doctrine deadly. This was the essential achievement, turning the enemy's rationality into vulnerability, converting tactical efficiency into strategic liability. The tramp steamers, the rusty colliers, the decrepit cargo vessels that Wallace through Atlantic swells with hidden guns and volunteer crews weren't miraculous technology. They were theatre, psychology and desperation forged into operational doctrine. They worked because they shouldn't have worked, because no rational navy would disguise warships as victims and sail them into the jaws of destruction. Yet Britain did exactly that, and German U-boats sailed straight into the trap, again and again, not through stupidity, but through the terrible logic of submarine warfare. In the end, the most effective weapon wasn't the hidden guns. It was doubt itself, introduced into every engagement, forcing every U-boat commander to wonder, is that really a helpless merchant, or is it Farnborough waiting to kill me?